Okay, hello everybody. This is Antonio Wolf here with my good friend Pedro. Reading today The Chinese Family and Kinship by Hugh D.R. Baker, a book which was given to me by another good Brazilian friend, my friend Tree. I don't know how the hell he found this, but it's a pretty damn good book. I forget what year is this from. 1979, so it's not that old.
Yeah.
And what I found surprising about this is the person who wrote this is not a Marxist, and is not a Hegelian. They don't give any hints. They don't name any categories that would even betray that they are, or they're even acquainted with such works. But this is straight up what is some of the top-notch, best historical materialist analyses one can make. And its structure is almost perfectly speculative, which is, to me, a good empirical confirmation of the thing which I say all the time. Anyone who thinks well is going to look Hegelian as fuck.
It's a pretty bold assertion, my friend. But I agree with you.
But anyways, let's get to it.
Go.
The composition of the family. The ideal family. The following quotations from different works on China are apparently contradictory, though all are talking of the family in the 20th century. Quote, the Kwok and Cheung families are very nearly of equal size, having an estimated 500 to 750 members each, while the smallest unit is Choi, with about 200 to 300 members. The average size of 5.21 persons per family may be taken as representative. The family multiplies as the children grow up and marry. It is not uncommon for the joint household to consist of 4 or 5 generations. End quote. I don't know. Is there anything contradictory about that? It doesn't seem contradictory.
I think that those are, each one of these paragraphs are from different sources, maybe. If you
I think they don't seem contradictory to me, though.
It's using a concept of extended family or clan, maybe.
Yeah.
Because you have 500 members to 750 members each, right? And maybe in the second quote, we are talking about nuclear family, right? And in the third quote, it's talking more about extended family relationships. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's not clear that these are different quotes, right?
Yeah. So anyways, clearly the authors of these statements were using the word family in different ways. But why the confusion? How big was the family? The confusion seems to have arisen largely through the Chinese belief in an ideal family. The ideal family consisted of some 5 generations living together as one unit, sharing one common purse and one common stove, and under one family head. The Chinese called this the 5-generation family, or 5 generations co-residing. Unfortunately, some Western observers seem to have accepted the ideal as the actual. Indeed, it is not unlikely that many Chinese people also were beguiled by their own culture into seeing the ideal where in fact it little existed. For the truth is that the 5-generation family was a rarity and was by no means the most common form of the Chinese family. But this family form is a useful model to bear in mind, for if we accept the ideal form as having been the ultimate aim of all family growth, then instead of looking at the various types of family as unconnected forms which happen to have existed in Chinese society, we may see them all as points in one development cycle. That is, instead of having a number of different family types to describe, we have one family model which was realized to a greater or lesser extent by all Chinese families.
Now I'm starting to understand why you said this is very Hegelian, right?
You'll see far stronger. Simple, stem, and extended families. The family was founded by the marriage of a man and a woman, and enlarged by the children by which they gave birth, or which they adopted. In this, often called the simple, or nuclear, or conjugal family, we recognize precisely the ingredients which make up our own families in the West. At its smallest, it consisted of two people, a man and his wife. It expanded according to the fertility of the couple, or perhaps according to their ability to adopt children. It might further expand by the addition of one or more concubines and their children. But the simple family is only the first point in the cycle. Differences from the Western family begin to show most clearly when we look at what happened to the children on marriage. While some, when they married, moved out from the parental home to set up new homes of their own and thus to establish new simple families, this was by no means always the case. Daughters, it is true, almost invariably did leave the parental home on marriage, but sons often brought their wives into the family and continued to live with their parents rather than set up new households and new families elsewhere. The most common instances of this type of family were where an only son brought his wife into the family, and where only one son amongst several did so. When the son and his wife produced children, there was then a 3-generation family. But of course, this kind of family, often called the stem family, was limited in duration. Sooner or later, the parents would die off, leaving behind a simple family once more, composed this time of their son, his wife, and children. A variant of this type was found where the parents might live in rotation with the families of their sons, creating a series of temporary stem families. Between them, the simple family and the stem family accounted for a very high percentage of Chinese families. But what if more than one son married and brought wives into the family? Then quite a different kind of group began to emerge. While by definition the simple family and the stem family were bound to be of small size and to prohibit growth, a family which has to grow and follow the road to the ideal must discourage its sons from setting up separate families elsewhere. They must all bring their wives home to the family, and their sons in turn must do the same. Once a family burst the barrier of expansion which the simple and stem family pattern constituted, there were all manner of possible permutations of size and generation depth which it could attain. It might go on expanding until the death of the parents, when the sons might decide to split the estate and set up separate families. The sons might, on the other hand, continue to stay together after the death of their parents. In some cases, fertility in the group might be low or mortality high, and keep family size down despite it's not losing any sons through division of the estate. In others, a family might be huge after only 3 generations or so. All these variants in which, in one generation, more than one married son was part of the group, we can conveniently parcel up in the term extended family. And the ultimate extended family was the ideal family. The simple family was a common factor in each of the other 2 types, so that either of them might be broken down into component simple families. There was a progression from simple family to ideal family, and a new married group was potentially the germ of any of the 3 types. So, the way the book ends up working is that we start with these simple units, and we start getting building upon each unit and getting more and more complex.
Yeah.
We will see economic relations and social relations arise from this.
Yeah. It looks a lot with idea that beginning with the most abstract concept, right, and developing it through its ultimate form.
Yep. Poverty and family size limitation. As we shall see later, the birth of a son was of the greatest importance to a family, not only in order to provide for the parents in their old age, but also in connection with ancestral worship. A daughter being of no help in either direction, her birth was not a matter of such joy or importance. All families, therefore, did their utmost either to beget a son, or, if that were impossible, to adopt one. Ideally, a family would have more than one son, thus both multiplying the blessings and ensuring against accident. The common expression of good wishes, quote, "May you have 100 sons and 1,000 grandsons," unquote, may have exaggerated the issue, but it faithfully represented Chinese feelings about the importance of male descendants. The following quotations are fairly cautious versions of what might be found in almost any description of rural China in the past 2 centuries. Quote, "It seems safe to conclude that the imperial countryside was overpopulated in the sense that the total amount of cultivated land was not sufficient to give the average peasant adequate means of livelihood. The economic forces tending to pauperize the farmer are clear. The extent and seriousness of indebtedness varies throughout the country. In numerous places, the owner tends to lose possession of his land to the moneylender and, at best, to become a tenant on his own farm. The tenant sells most of his crop immediately after harvest to pay his debts and is almost at once in need of further loans." Sharecropping. Much older than people imagine.
Yep.
For a poor family struggling for survival, For a poor family struggling for survival in such conditions, there can have been little hope of raising a large number of sons, and many perhaps could count themselves fortunate if they could raise even one. It is immediately obvious, then, that wealth or the lack of it was most important in determining family size. The ideal family could not be achieved by the majority of this for the simple reason that they could not support sufficient children to begin the necessary expansion. The factors limiting family size were numerous. Some of them, such as high infant death rate and a high rate of general mortality, were the direct consequences of undernourishment, overwork, inability to afford medical care, and other conditions attendant upon poverty. It may even have been that there was a connection between poverty and infertility, so that fewer live children were born to poor parents. In the 1930s, it was found that, quote, the mortality in childhood and early adulthood is exceedingly high, higher than in every country listed except India. The terrific mortality of the early years of life in China and India is brought out dramatically by these survival figures. In these countries, less than 60% of the persons born alive survive the 10th year, while at age 10 in England and Wales and the United States, about 90%, and in New Zealand, about 95% of those born are still living. One half of the people born in India scarcely attain their majority, and one half of those born in China die before they are 28 years of age. Unquote. Just as an aside, I didn't realize this, and I don't think the vast majority of people, particularly in the United States at least, realize how poor China was before the Communist Revolution. It is no joke that what China has accomplished is a miracle in comparison to anything in history and anything in any other country in the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Like, it was literally the worst country.
Yeah, I think many people do their analysis on China, forgetting what was going on there before the Cultural Revolution and Mao, etc., right? Just like in Cuba, which was like a big brothel, right, before the revolution. It was not a serious country at all. So it's interesting to see these figures, to imagine that less than 60% of the persons born alive are not able to complete 10 years, right, of life. This is simply dramatic, right? It's about those people were constantly dealing with the death of children, right?
Yep.
It was a common thing.
Continuing. Other factors might be called indirect consequences of poverty, in that they were not the physical results of poverty itself, but rather the social results of what Chinese custom dictated should be done in conditions of poverty. Infanticide, for instance, may be called an indirect consequence of poverty, as opposed to the direct consequence represented by, say, the death of a child from malnutrition. Among indirect consequences, we can point to the killing, abandonment, selling, and out-adoption of children, non-marriage, late marriage, and birth control. A poor couple who had produced as many children as they could support, perhaps just the one son, might practice total abstention from sexual intercourse in order to guard against further pregnancies. This method of birth control was certainly common among older couples. Quote, husbands and wives sleep in the same room as long as their sons are not married. After the latter's marriage, some parents continue to sleep in the same room, others do not. After the birth of a grandchild, it is definitely more desirable for the older couple to live in different rooms. It would be considered disgraceful for the older woman to become pregnant after such an event. Unquote. Abortion as a form of birth control is reported by some writers. Despite these practices, and we do not know how common they were, many children were born into families which could not support them. Infanticide was one method of dealing with the problem. It was probably not as widespread as or frequently practiced as a custom as has commonly been supposed, but there is no doubt that it did go on, particularly with regard to girl babies. Li Tseng-se, Kinship of 1847 and Governor General of Jiangsu, and Anhui in the mid-1860s said of his native Shanzi, quote, I have learned of the prevalence of female infanticide in all parts of Shanzi, but particularly in such southern counties as Pingting, Yutsu, etc. The first female birth may sometimes be salvaged with effort, but the subsequent births are usually drowned. There are even those who drown every female baby without keeping any. The poor regarded the practice as an almost legitimate means of maintaining their minimal standard of living and, in any case, as a dire economic necessity." Unquote.
Interesting how dire the consequences are of a family which is not taken as a right, like it's an institution which is constantly being harassed by other forms of existence, right? Like, man, they were killing a lot of girls out there because they couldn't afford to have a girl. Simply as that.
Yeah.
That is still happening, actually, but I don't think it's a physical death anymore. It's more like abandonment, like children of poor parents are less likely to have their parents' attention, are less likely to be able to actually develop a proper connection with their parents because their parents are tired. Their parents cannot give them like proper attention after a full day of tiring work. Like, people are not killing their sons and daughters, but they are abandoning them.
Yeah,
for sure.
That's certainly true. Very, very true. Continuing. Drowning was the most common form of infanticide, but there were others, such as smothering and burying alive. Estimates of the extent of the practice vary considerably. Quote, "Authorities such as Dr. Dudgeon, Dr. Lockhart, Professor Giles, Bishop Moley, Dr. Martin, and Dr. G.E. Morrison believe it is not more practiced than in Europe. On the other hand, Sir J. Barrow stated that in Peking alone, 24 infants daily were thrown out to die and were collected by carts at night. Mr. Douglas asserts that in Fujian, 20% of the female infants were destroyed. Mr. Michi stated that it was a very common occurrence among the poor. Missionaries in Guangdong have said that in certain districts, only 1 out of 3 females is allowed to live. Parents in those parts are obliged to go to other places to purchase wives for their sons. Places specially mentioned in connection with the crime are Kandon, Fuchao, Hinghua, Amoy, Tsungming, Ningpo, Hankou, and Kiangsu province." Unquote. Abandoning of children was also resorted to, often with a real hope that they would be saved from death and given a home. Quote, "At the prefectural city of Chao near Swato, the author saw outside the walls of the city a basket hanging against the wall, looking from a distance something like a cradle. A piece of matting was fastened above it, forming a sort of pent roof to shelter it from the rain and sun. In this basket is put any baby whom its parents do not care to preserve, and should any charitable person be so disposed, he or she may lift out the forsaken infant and take it home. Failing such rescue, the child ultimately meets the fate of so many of the inhabitants of babydom in China." End quote. Babies were often abandoned on the doorstep of wealthy families or large businesses, inviting the charity of the inmates. In more recent years, banks in Hong Kong have been much favored in this respect. Orphanages did exist, but they tended to come into active life only in response to pressing initiatives of influential men or hard times. Quote, "The effectiveness of orphanages in lessening the incidence of female infanticide varied from place to place and from time to time. An orphanage adequately provided with funds in 19th century Xiaokan County in Hubei was said to have saved the lives of some 10,000 female babies within the first 3 years of its founding." End quote. Children could be sold. There was a ready market for girls to act as servants, concubines, and prostitutes, but parents had first to raise them to an age when they could be useful, and this they could not necessarily afford to do. One 19th century account goes so far as to give the established prices in Peking. So common was the practice. Quote, "At the present day, a young girl of 10 or 12 is worth, at Peking, from 30 to 50 taels, and young women commonly fetch from 250 to 300 taels. Poverty is the prime cause of the full markets, and especially in times of famine, drought, and pestilence, it is common for men who at other times would shrink with abhorrence from the deed to sell their wives and daughters to the highest bidders. Gambling is also responsible for much of the poverty which produces this state of things, and in all large towns there are recognized brokers who deal in these human wares." Unquote. It was generally understood that a girl sold to be a servant would eventually be found a husband and allowed to marry out of servitude at the expense of her masters. Girls sold as servants were, quote, handed over by a poor family against a customary indemnity in money to a well-to-do family who will feed, clothe, and house the child until she is of marriageable age, when a husband will be found for her. In return, she works in the household. Her position, however, is better than that of a mere household servant. She eats at the family table and is considered something between a servant and a modest member of the family. Her parents are supposed to, by custom, to be allowed to visit her from time to time, in order to be at ease in their hearts as to the child's fate. This custom, which prevails in South China, seems to have given rise to a certain amount of abuse. End quote.
Yeah. Like, it's interesting that you're talking about it, because this kind of things, I think this is still happening in poor countries everywhere, right? So there are these poor families that they are not able to actually raise their child, and then they like work for a rich family, and there is like a generational relationship between this poor family and this rich family, in which like you are, for example, you are a person working for this family, and you know that your child will be working for that family too, you know. And most of those people actually live in these families' homes, and there is even like a saying in Brazil of those rich families. They say they are just like family, you know what I mean? But they are not. Like they like to brag about how they let their servants eat with them in their table, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Boys, too, were sold as servants, though this was much more rare. Once purchased, the boy was likely to remain with his masters throughout his life. He would probably be found a wife by them, but in contrast to the case of female servants, marriage did not release him from his position. Instead, it was likely that his sons also would remain as servants in the same household. A kind of hereditary retainership was thus set up, to be broken sooner or later by manumission or the failure of the fortunes of the master house. The treatment of servants was in general good, relations between master and servant frequently being quite informal and unhampered by social barriers of avoidance or non-communication. Reluctant as parents might have been to part with their children, there was often a better life ahead of the sold than of the sellers. Infanticide, abandonment, and selling were most often practiced in the case of daughters. Sons might fall victim to one or another of these methods of family limitation, but they were more likely to be adopted out of the family which could not support them. With high child mortality rates, the heirless were common, and adoption necessarily played a most important role. Ideally, it was confined to transactions between close agnatically related kin. That is to say, the most favored kind of adoption was where a man adopted the son of his brother. But in practice, regard for the ideal was probably less than nice. An adopted son lost all rights in his natal family in return for full rights in his family of adoption. As with selling, there was a good chance that the son would profit by the move. The children raised by a family might reasonably expect marriage as their eventual lot. In the case of a girl in particular, it seems that recognition by the parents of the obligation to marry off their daughter was implicit in their raising her to adulthood. The concept of spinster might be said to be alien to traditional Chinese society. Indeed, there is no separate term for it in Chinese, the usual translation being not unmarried woman but girl not yet married, a significant distinction. That the Chinese system of ancestral worship failed to cater for diseased unmarried females is a related fact which need not surprise us. But for very exceptional circumstances, then, grown daughters were invariably married off. A report of a field study made in the 1930s tells us that in a village of the Yangtze Plain, the sex ratio which results from female infanticide actually makes it difficult for poor boys to get a mate. If we take 16 as the lower age limit for marriage, we find that there are 128 marriageable men, or 25% of the total, who are still single. On the other hand, there are only 29 women above 16, or 8% of the total, who are unmarried. Not a single woman above 25 is a spinster, but there are still 43 bachelors above 25. So, related to that, if one looks it up, like it's been in the news in the last couple of years. Again, this whole thing, like, oh well, because of the one-child policy, there's not enough women in China, so something like 30% of young men are going unmarried because there's not enough women. But as we can see from this, this has always been the case, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I bet there is a I bet it is very frustrating, and I think that actually causes a situation in which women become like an article of luxury. You know what I mean? Like, to be able to be like a man who can afford to marry a woman is already a sign of a good situation.
Yep.
Because I bet this distribution of these women is not random, right? Only the most high value man, as those strange people in manosphere say, high value man. Only them are able to actually get married.
Yeah, not only that, it's a struggle mainly because of the women that there are. They don't want to marry. It's just modern views. They're like, oh well, I don't want to have kids. I want to have they're like, I got a profession. I want to do some stuff. I don't want to have kids.
There's that, right? And there's that.
It's also part of the problem. Continuing. Sons might be raised and not later married. Thus, a poor family which had with difficulty managed to procure a wife for its eldest son might be incapable of financing the wedding of a second son, or indeed of supporting another wife if it did. In such cases, the unmarried sons might continue to live with the family, or they might leave to seek better fortune elsewhere. Under the traditional inheritance pattern, a man's estate was divided more or less equally between all his sons. If an already barely economic estate had to be divided in this way, then clearly the shares would be viable for none of the sons. Non-marriage of all but the eldest son, however, meant that it was probably unnecessary to divide the estate, since the third generation must in any case reunite the shares in one parcel. With the traditional Chinese view of the family as a long-term continuing entity, one may interpret the marrying of only one son as a paring down of the family to a slender thread which had both a chance of survival and the best hope of revival of family fortunes. Poverty could also delay the marriage of sons while the necessary wealth was gradually built up. The longer the delay, the greater the limiting effect on the family, not only because of the more imminent death of the parents, but also because of the reduced reproductive span of the couple whose marriage was delayed, and because of the pile-up effect on younger sons, who were expected to wait their turn for marriage. Naturally enough, the majority of Chinese families were poor, and if poverty implied inability to expand the family, it follows that the simple and stem forms of the family must have been the most common in China. But what of the wealthy families? Were they necessarily different in form? We are led on to a series of considerations which are not all economic. Pro and con the extended family. There were both idealistic and practical reasons for advocating the extended family. On the idealistic side, it may be pointed out that the family was seen as the basic unit of society. From at least as early as the 5th century BC, that is, about the time of Confucius, there had existed a list of the important relationships by which a man's life should be ordered, and family relationships always figured large in this list. In the doctrine of the mean, Zongyang, a work traditionally held to have been written by the grandson of Confucius, appears the following. By the way, the Doctrine of the Mean is really good. It's not very long. I would compare it to the stuff by Heraclitus. It's highly speculative. One of the things in which I would say I don't get why Hegel claimed that they weren't speculative, because it is a very speculative work. Continuing. There are 5 universally applicable principles: that of the relationship between ruler and minister, that of father and son, of husband and wife, of elder and younger brother, and of friend and friend. End quote. Mencius, another philosopher of the same period, comments, quote, there should be affection between father and son, righteous sense of duty between ruler and minister, division of function between man and wife, stratification between old and young, and good faith between friends. End quote. The list of relationships most commonly found in more modern works is 1. Ruler-minister. 2. Father-son. 3. Elder-brother, younger-brother. 4. Husband-wife. 5. Friend-friend. Now, these 5 human relationships, wulun, were arranged in order of priority, and with the exception of the last one, were all superior-inferior relationships too. And so they were intended to give guidance as to the correct weight to be put on any relationships. Properly observed, there could be no conflict or friction between Chinese society or within the family group, for every member of the family and of society was held tightly in check by the duty and obedience which he owed to another. Properly observed, there could be no conflict, because there was no area of human intercourse not covered explicitly or implicitly by one or another of the 5 clauses. By the way, you know the trolley problem, right, Pedro? The ones like trolley's coming, and it's you either pull the lever or you don't. Somebody told me about the Chinese trolley problem, or the equivalent of, which is instead of like 1 or 5 people, it's like your wife and your mother are drowning in a lake. Who do you save?
Okay. Yes.
For the Chinese, this is an ethical dilemma.
Yeah. Now we can even say, if there is a list of priority, if your ruler and your mother are drowning in a lake, who would you save? That's not a dilemma. Seems that's not a dilemma for them. Save the ruler.
Because if you don't, you die.
Yeah.
Okay, what was it? Continuing. The order of those priorities dealing with the family was such that the group could continue to grow indefinitely without friction arising between any of its members. Indeed, if the duties and respect required of each member were to be properly observed, then the group must continue to grow indefinitely, for it would not be possible to carry out one's duty of service to one's parents, for instance, if one were not living with them. From the point of view of Confucian political philosophers, there was much to be said for the extended family. As the acknowledged basis of Chinese society, the family was in any case very important, and it would clearly be socially advantageous if its stability, conservatism, and mutual responsibility could be spread wider through the expanding of the group. From the viewpoint of the individual in society, membership of such an expanded family enabled him to realize an ideal of human relationships which satisfied both his own desire for tangible stability and also the culturally implanted yearning for just such an extended kin group. We have records showing that 5 generations co-residing families existed and were applauded at least as far back as the Tang Dynasty, over 1,000 years ago. But the vehicle which transmitted knowledge of the ideal and which bore the doctrinal influences which made its attainment possible was the written word, and literacy and education were largely confined to the wealthy. So we must expect that even in this idealistic sphere, wealth was of some importance. The practical reasons.
That, but he means here that, like, many people, because they were illiterate, they wouldn't even hear about this idealistic conception of family.
Let's see. Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
Yeah, because
And
it's very
yeah,
clear that this idealistic sphere is completely limited by economical reasons, right? Economical
yeah.
conditions. But there is also this cultural condition of being able to actually have access to this transmitted knowledge of the ideal.
Yeah, yeah. The practical reasons for advocating the extended family were mainly economic ones. Again, the tradition of equal inheritance between sons must be considered. Whereas in the West, great families contrived to preserve whole their estates by a system of primogeniture, which prevented younger sons from inheriting land, the Chinese system worked to ensure the rapid breakdown of estates. A large estate divided between X number of sons might yield X number of viable units, but the chances of those X estates eventually dividing up among the succeeding generation into yet more still viable units were less good. Unless more land were added each generation, or unless only one son per generation was born. The original estate was reduced to multiple uneconomic parcels in a short space of years. Let us suppose a comfortably off family of father, mother, 3 married sons, their wives, and children, and let us endow them with a house and an estate of 3 rice fields, the fields being of equal size, though separated from each other by an hour's walk. Now, on the death of the father, the 3 sons decide to divide the estate. Since no 2 fields were ever considered to be of exactly equivalent yield, the 3 rice fields will each be divided into 3 portions. The sons have immediately lost a certain amount of land, for physical divisions must be driven through the fields. Worse, where 1 plow and 1 piece of each farm tool were sufficient before, now 3 of each are required. There is a capital outlay involved. Again, where before it had been perfectly reasonable to walk a few miles to work in one of the fields, now each son is faced with the prospect of a long hike with a heavy plow to work on only a very tiny patch of land at the end of it. And what about the house? That perhaps cannot be divided. One of them must agree either to have the house and take less land than the others, or buy their shares in the house from them, or they must all sell the house and divide the money. Or they must try to live together harmoniously despite the economic separation. But with the capital outlay involved in setting up new households and the small size of the share of each son, none of them is able to make a livelihood from his inheritance. An extreme example, perhaps, but hopefully illustrative of the effects of the equal inheritance system. But the extended family was a case where the estate was not divided, where land and property remained whole, and where the income from them was used for the benefit of the total group. Quote, in the peasant household, all sons who could work went to these markets to seek employment, and no distinction was made between the eldest or youngest son working out of the village. Because the land was to be divided equally between the sons, the eldest was not favored, as would have been the case if the inheritance dictated the land revert to him. The sons gave their wages to the household head, who pooled it with the income earned from the harvest. End quote. Land was the basis of family wealth and the most important form of property in traditional China. I don't know, from what I've learned from Irony, land is still the basis of family wealth for the vast majority of people, insofar as they can have any wealth whatsoever. If you don't own the house, at least in the U.S., if you don't own a house in the U.S., you have nothing.
Yeah. It reminds me of a song from Kendrick Lamar, right? In which he's basically like expressing these different priorities in life, but each one of these ideas are racialized. So there is the priority of the black man, the white man, the Asian man, and then the Indian man. The Indian man says something like, buy property, man. Get generational perks from property because dirt will not disappear out of the blue, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So it's the most secure and actually concrete form of wealth, right? It can survive like a economical trust crisis in which a certain general representation of value actually disappears, but you still have your land. right? If
Yep.
if 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 something happens, so the money can out of the blue lose its value, because its value is not intrinsic. It's a purely social relationship, while land has actually some natural basis to its value, right? It can actually grow food in it.
Yeah. But like in the situation in the U.S., for example, it's mostly just about it's a vehicle of wealth, where the land appreciates not because of like any like food production or anything, but because like business accrues around it, and therefore prices get driven up over time, and then you die, you leave that to your children, and that gets split up, or somebody keeps the house or whatever.
Yep.
Continuing. Land was the basis of family wealth and most important form of property in traditional China. It had symbolic as well as economic value, and families would relinquish their holdings only when there was no other option for survival left to them. Quote, mortgages were more common than sales and were redeemable at any period after the original mortgage, so that land need not pass outside the clan forever. A 60-year-old mortgage, which was discovered in the land registers when succession was being determined, was honored by the mortgagees, though grudgingly, the real point at issue being the amount of compensation and not the return of the land, as no figure was stated in the original entry.
What? You mean like you make a mortgage and you do not determine the price of it?
Yeah, they forgot to write the price.
What?
They were in a hurry.
It's like it's infinite. It's not buying, it's lending, right?
So continuing, let us look at our example family again. The three sons decide that they will not divide the estate, but will carry on as before their father's death and live and budget as one unit. They are not faced with any extra capital expenditure on house purchase or farming equipment. They do not lose precious land through dividing buns. At the very busy planting and harvest times, they are a sufficiently large labor force that they do not need to hire outside help in order to get the work done. They find that, with help from the wives and children, just two of them are capable of running the farm side of the estate, while sparing the third, who is then able to go to the nearby market town to work in or perhaps open a shop, and so they can diversify and increase the income of the group. They are able to support the education of the brightest of the young generation, and so on. Quote, the group of which Lin Shangyung was the Chiacheng family head consisted of 42 persons. In the oldest generation, only Lin himself survived. In the second generation, the marriage of each of his three sons had led to the formation of as many Fang conjugal families. The first of these had 22 members. In addition to the father and mother, it included 5 sons and 2 daughters, the wife and 7 children of the first son, and the wife and 4 children of the second. The second Fang, 12 persons in all, consisted of a father, a mother, 4 sons, 4 daughters, and the wife and child of the first son. In the third Fang, the father and mother, there were 5 young children. With the father and mother, there were 5 young children. The Ling Xia family had established 4 households, each associated with a part of the estate. There were the buildings and fields that had been obtained and later expanded by Sheng Yung when he separated from his brother. In an adjoining village, the Chia owned a rice mill, and in yet another nearby settlement it operated a shop selling fertilizers and animal feed. About 25 miles to the south, additional land and buildings had been purchased. In the management of all these holdings, a common budget was maintained. Funds and goods were transferred as needed, and expenditure by the manager of a given enterprise was scrutinized by other group members. End quote. It's a pretty slick family business right there. With all these economic advantages goes the political advantage of being a large, united group vis-a-vis the rest of society. They are much less vulnerable to intimidatory pressures of all kinds, both ideally and practically.
Sorry, but this is a very important thing here. Like, this kind of family solidarity actually binds you to certain duties within family, but at the same time, it gives you some kind of freedom against outer threats, right? So you know there are like a whole lot of people with you if you get into conflict in civil society, right?
Yep.
Which is something we are losing more and more nowadays, right? We don't have anywhere to go. If we get fucked in the public sphere, you have no one for you. Even your friends, they don't have that kind of connection to you as to put their asses in the, as we say in Brazilian Portuguese, put their asses in the line and actually assume risks to defend you, right?
Yep.
So to have a family in this context, it seems very important because you don't need to suck up for assholes and jerks outside of your family sphere if you don't want to, right? You have your
Yep.
family.
Yep. It's definitely increases your freedom. Both ideally and practically, the extended family seems to have immense advantages. Given sufficient wealth to sustain the group, it seems the obvious form for a Chinese family to have taken. Indeed, quote, I would suggest that the tendency to diversify was also found among the peasantry, but was less obvious. Peasants were prone to marry at a later age and have fewer children survive to maturity, so that in many cases available labor must have been absorbed in the cultivation of family lands. Among the very poor, with little or no land, the effort was to obtain minimal subsistence by any means available. But given a land base of some sort, the hope of economic advancement through diversification might enable the poor to rationalize their desire for many sons. End quote. Yet the incidence of extended families was apparently not high even among the comparatively wealthy. We must now look at the divisive as well as the cohesive features involved. In a nutshell, these divisive features could mostly be summed up in popular phrases such as human nature or personality clash. We have already talked a little of the 5 human relationships and have hinted at their importance for society and family. The more broadly social aspect will be taken up again in a later chapter, but for now let us isolate from the 5 the 3 which deal specifically with the family, namely the father-son, elder brother-younger brother, and husband-wife relationships. Each of these is to be taken at face value primarily, but each also may be extended to include a wider group. Thus, the father-son relationship may be taken to include the mother-son, father-unmarried daughter, and mother-unmarried daughter relationships, while further extensions governs the relationship between seniors and junior generations. The elder brother-younger brother relationships holds good for the various permutations of brother-unmarried sister, and may be extended to cover the relationship between age and youth, or elder and younger. The husband-wife relationship extends to, of course, to husband-concubine, but also shows the proper relationship of the two sexes. Remember that all of these 3 relationships are ones of superiority-inferiority, and that they are listed in order of priority. Therefore, the pecking order which results from this is 1. Generation, 2. Age, 3. Sex. Theoretically, then, any one person should know precisely where he stands in the family by referring to this order. There is a watertight chain of relationships which makes clear to whom each owes respect and obedience. We can illustrate this point with a diagrammatic representation of our example family of father, mother, 3 married sons, and their unmarried children, as in figure 1. 2 triangles male, circles female, triangle connected to circle, married couple, and triangle bracket connection to circle, siblings. Triangle being the elder, circle being the younger. Okay.
Oh, so like the first source of authority is determined by generational relationships, and then age, and then sex.
Yeah. So it'd be oldest by generation, so father, son, grandson, that relationship.
Yeah.
The next one is within the generations is older brother to younger brother, older sister to younger sister, And then within that, it's male to female, with male being the superior, female being the inferior.
Yeah.
So even if the sister were older than the son still has priority, rather has authority over the sister because he's male.
Yeah.
Everyone owes obedience to the father because he is superior in generation, age, and sex. Everyone but the father owes obedience to the mother because she is senior in generation and age. The eldest son's wife, 4, owes obedience to her father-in-law and mother-in-law because of generation and age, and her allegiance to her husband is only a secondary concern because it is founded on the less important sex superiority. The youngest son owes obedience to his elder brother's wives, his elder brothers, his mother and father. The youngest grandson has to obey all the others. The unmarried girls, and 10 and 11, are only temporary members of the group because they must eventually be married out of it. Okay, there you go. Now, there is a structural conflict involved in this model because while generation is clearly superior to age, it is not the case that age is clearly superior to sex. That is to say, 7, which is what? 7 is a brother. Let's say 7 can easily see that he owes obedience to 1 and 2. 1 and 2 being the father and mother. And to 3 and 5. Because they are older brothers. But he may well feel that he is superior to 4 and 6 on sex grounds and that these should override the age consideration. Especially might this be true where 4 and 6 could be wives or concubines considerably younger than himself, though their age ranking is in accordance with their husbands, not their own ages. Thus, the heavy emphasis on male superiority in Chinese society already makes for some conflict in this theoretical model. Oh. Okay, so it's like they might have to be subservient to their older brothers' wives because they would count as a generation above him. Well, maybe not a generation above him, but they're older. And I thought like sex trumped it, but I guess not.
Nope. Sex would be like...
It's a third, yes. So sex is lower on the rung than age, huh?
Yeah. But not as clearly, I think. That's what he means.
Yeah.
There could be conflict around that, right?
Yep.
Like, you should obey me because I'm older than you. But no, but you're a female. It doesn't matter if I'm younger than you, you're a female, right? So there could be conflict on that ground.
Yeah.
And it seems that this conflict was usually resolved to the side of sex superiority.
All right, continuing. Thus, the heavy emphasis on male superiority in Chinese society already makes for some conflict in this theoretical model. Let us see what other tensions are built into it. The father-son relationship was so heavily bolstered by ancestor worship, by the legal system, and by the great weight of public opinion that it should have been the least fragile of the bonds dealt with in the Wu Lun. Quote, the relationship between father and child was none of the warmth... The relationship between father and child has none of the warmth and freedom existing between mother and child. The father's attitude is dignified, even remote. His authority is unquestioned, and he expects submissiveness from his sons. When the son is an infant, the father may on rare occasions play with him or take him out. When the boy is old enough to help in the fields, father and son walk together and work together quite often. But by the time the boy reaches the age of 15, the father assumes a more dignified attitude toward him and is frequently severe. The son feels uncomfortable with his father and prefers to work with the other men in the fields. When father and son do work together, they have nothing to say, and even at home they speak only when there is business to discuss. At street gatherings or in places of amusement, they mutually avoid each other. End quote. Oh, that is cold.
Yeah, yeah, and it must be like a traumatic transition, right? Because the father is supposed to break up like informal relationships with his son only when he's 15, right? So there must be a transitional process here, which could have been very dramatic and traumatic for the boy. Like out of the blue, my father is not treat me treating me like family, you know.
Yeah. Continuing. Paternal authority was strong, but for this very reason conflict in the later years of the father's life became possible. Used to command and physical superiority, he had to face the fact that his sons would come to dominate the sphere of physical activity, and that they would be less and less willing to accept his judgment as he got older. Mature sons might well respond to an authoritarian father by demanding immediate division of the family estate. The father would be left some land for his own maintenance, but the family as such would be dead. Or example family would have become 4 separate units, as in figure 2. But supposing that the authority of the father and the loyalty of the other members of the family remain strong, then there is a good chance that the group will hold together at least until his death, and even until the death of the mother, should she survive him. If we now kill off the father and the mother from our original undivided family, as in figure 3, we expose several rich sources of conflict in the group. The deaths have removed from the family the first of the priority relationships, namely the generation 1. That is to say, the weightiest of the unifying factors has gone, so the unifying burden falls on the age and sex relationships within the now senior generation. We have already indicated that there is a lack of clear priority between these two, but we might here enlarge further on the difficulties at this stage in family development. To continue the function as a unit, there must be cooperation of a high order between the 3 brothers and their wives. What keeps the brothers together? Natural affection? Well, possibly, but there is often a great rivalry and often dislike between Chinese brothers. This rivalry is perhaps exacerbated by a structural paradox. The brothers are economic equals under the inheritance system, but not equals in that of the age relationship in that the age relationship gives precedence to the oldest, so that the younger brothers may have less control over the joint estate than their shares warrant, this giving rise to resentment and conflict. If not natural affection, then the elder brother-younger brother relationship of superiority-inferiority must take the strain. But what if youngest brother 7 gets on better with elder brother 5 than with elder brother 3, and will not do as 3 tells him? And what if 3 is stupid and makes wrong decisions on behalf of the family, while 5 and 7 are much brighter and could run things more efficiently? And what if 5 is willful and insists on not doing as 3 tells him? On the economic side, what if 5 is lazy and does less than his share of the work? What if 7 is extremely hardworking and does more than his share? What if 3, in his role as family head, should apportion the income unfairly to each of the 3 major sections of the family? Truly, these are the questions of future communism. People don't think about that. People want to abolish the family, and they just think people are just going to get along, right? And that has to be the least. The fact that I ever thought that has to be the most shamefully stupid thing that I ever thought. The fact that it's not obvious to us that you get a bunch of people together, and clearly not everybody is equal on the effort side, on the capacity side, and this shit happens. It happens in any family. The fact that it happens in even a nuclear family makes it so much clearer that this is going to happen to a far worse extent on an even more extended family.
And there is also in this conception of a nation as a huge family, right? There is this idea that you can share, for example, affection and respect equally throughout everybody. And that's simply not the case. I was discussing one of the days about that, and after reading your essay on the justification of differences different treatment between kinship and friends and stuff. I asked the man. I said to him because he was always trying to bring up this socialist idea of a community in which like 300 people are able to get along very well without any hierarchy, without any conflict, and with no family relationships mediating these communitary relationships. And I asked him, well, so tell me one thing. Why is your mother not paying my university? You know what I mean? Because he was always insisting in this idea that, well, there is no reason for differential treatment, right? Everybody should treat each other like equals. And I said, well, but so someone can just pass by and says, come on, pay a fucking ice cream to my son. And he was like, oh, that's not what I meant, but that's exactly what you're saying, right? So what is the line of division of responsibilities towards people? If it is not family like, what is like, right?
Yeah. Not only that, I mean, like, we know, for example, that there's been plenty like communes where like shit happens, like a lot of the hippie communes like didn't last very long. For example, in the U.S.
Nope. Nope.
Because people could not like the whole thing. Oh well, we're just gonna leave it up to people to do the right thing. People don't do the right things, and it's partly is the social issue of just like people are assholes. Like it's the U.S. is an asshole society, so you can't expect people to just do the right thing, and keep things clean, or do like I do the dishes here, and you do it tomorrow, the next person tomorrow. Okay.
Yeah.
But then you always have the lazy person. Like it always happens, unfortunately. And then
Not only about laziness, it's also about like an equal division of skills. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like there are people who are very good at cleaning, and there are people who are very good at doing contability. I lived for a while in Republica, and I noticed that there was a priority there, concerning the recognition of effort within the community. And the top priority was like to be a good cooker, right? You had to be able to make good meals. If you were able to make good meals, you would be pretty much immediately recognized by that effort. And you had to be a good cleaner, right? And I remember those people who were good cleaners and good cookers, they had it all, okay? But at the same time, there was a lot of formal issues, contabilistic issues that those people wouldn't even think about, that would be, they would be treated by people who were actually like, capable of doing those things. But these people were not publicly recognized. Those were like hard jobs that demanded skills, right? And dealing with money, dealing with formalities concerning like the government or stuff like that. These people were very capable on that, but if they were not capable on cleaning and cooking, they wouldn't be recognized anyhow. But the contrary was not true. You know what I mean? So there is also
stuff like that.
It's not like only the dispute around like who does more. It is also about a dispute about what is a priority of recognition in this community, and also a dispute about what is good, right? That will never disappear. We cannot erase this like moral disputes without erasing humankind altogether.
Yeah. Which is why I don't find like, people complain about the nuclear family. Like, I like the idea of the extended family, but sometimes you just don't get along with family, and so it's good that you can have the chance to have the nuclear family and just like, move out and get your own house or whatever. Sometimes you just can't get along.
Sometimes you don't agree with a clan head, right?
Yeah.
The head of the clan. Right, I remember he has this very interesting talk in which he says this left-wing defense of nuclear family, in which he says that Nuclear family is actually an emancipation from clan family, right? Or we would say extended family in the vocabulary of this author in specific. But yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
I think left wing politics nowadays centers its attacks on a certain idea of family that they cannot justify. Why is that like the family and that's it? And they are always like trying to say, oh, we need solidarity, but at the same time they're attacking the last kinds of real non-economical solidarity that we have in society, which is, for example, the bond between the son and his mother.
Yep. I mean, and you and I are on the same page about the idiocy of like attacking the family.
There is a certain empirical existing entity which usually is confused by family. It's like a distorted family which does not live up to its concept, and that should be criticized, right? A naturalized family based on asymmetrical asymmetrical conventional relationships between fixed gender identities, that should be criticized. But I don't know any left-wing theory which has presented me a substitute for this immediate solidarity which families fulfills. Like,
Yep.
I don't know any of it. They always get into a point in which they cannot hold to explicitly either like demand a kind of very, very dry and isolating individualism, right, in which you only live for yourself, or this utopian dream of a society of pure love in which you distribute your love equally and your affection equally to everybody, and everybody gets along, and there is no mediation between, I don't know, state and individual, right? There is no mediation between civil society and individual. I mean, that's not going to work out, my friends. There's going like it may work for a sect and for a while, and we know that sects are not very healthy, right?
Yep. No, yeah. Like I totally agree with Irony that the nuclear family is an emancipation from the clan. I mean, I know plenty of families in which like they're bunched up because they're forced to, but they live like cats and dogs. They just don't like each other. They don't get along. The best thing that would be if they could would be like they'd have the freedom to get the hell out. Just go have their own place.
Yeah,
because it is freeing. It's like sometimes you just can't get along with people.
Yeah, that's true. And there is also, but just another commentary, and there is also this dream of regression in many people nowadays. They take some anthropological examples of tribes in which you don't even need recognition of direct kinship by the father's side, and that's so beautiful, and everybody are a big family of 50 people living together. Okay, dude, but are you willing to sacrifice the complex division of labor that exists within our society so you can live like an indigenous person nowadays? Like those are like contradictory, paradoxical desires. These people were what industrial societies with a vibe of small communities living together, and liking each other equally, or at least respecting each other equally, or having equal kinds of duties to everybody. Well, that's not the case. You can't have headphones to listen to music and then want to go back to a idyllic historical past in which like nuclear family never existed.
No, yeah. I mean, there's also the sense in which, like the economic, the fact that economy and family is different, and economy and politics should be different, is itself also a form of freedom.
Yes.
I don't know that many people, but I do know some people who've been part of family business. It's not always great to have family and business mix. Like people are like, oh, business is like family. Sometimes you don't want that. Sometimes you just want to. I just want to come here. I want to do the work. I want to get paid, and I want to go home. And I don't want to. I don't want my boss. Yeah, I don't want to care about my boss. I don't want my boss to be my friend. I don't want him to be a part of my family.
Yeah, even with friends is a complicated issue, right? Even if with friends, imagine with families.
Yeah, that distance is itself a freeing thing. As strange as it
you
is.
don't need to. You can simply tell your partner, well, you are not completing your duties, so fuck off, goodbye. But to say that to your mother because she's incompetent in business isn't the same thing, right? Mother, I'm sorry, I'm going to expel you from the table of investors in this business. So it's funny because in these cases, either family is destroyed or the business is destroyed, right?
Yep. Anyways, good tangent. Let's get back to this. Where were we?
But again, let us say that the brothers...
Okay, there we go. But again, let us say that the brothers do get on well and are able to live together in harmony. Still, there are their wives to consider. A wife's only tie with her husband's family is through him, and her future is intimately bound up with his and with her sons. A wife may be expected then to see her husband's interest as paramount in importance, and she may well lack much of the feeling for a group unity which her husband and his brothers have. Oh man, I know this too well. In Latino families, this is not a rare occasion of son's wife comes in and tears the family apart because she's interested in herself and her immediate family, which is her husband and her kids, and fuck the mom and dad, the grandpas, and fuck the rest of the family because she doesn't care.
Yeah, she doesn't have an actually natural kinship with any one of those, right?
Oh yeah.
So I'm thinking about my children. I'm thinking about my husband. I'm thinking about my most immediate family, which is my nuclear family. So fuck your brother. Your brother is a jerk.
Yeah, it happens so often, where, they come in and, they start, playing brothers against father and sisters, they start pointing out, hey, look, why do they get to do this and you don't? How come they get this and you don't? That's unfair. And they start creating bitterness and rivalry where there wasn't before.
Yeah.
In this, she is perhaps bolstered by control of private funds to which neither her in-laws nor even her husband have access. These funds originally came to her as wedding gifts, and she may guard them as a physical token of the potential and desirable independence of the family composed of herself, her husband, and her children. Quote, it is customary and expected that the wife should surrender the sequoia, private money, to her husband when they form their own family unit, even if her finances had previously remained completely independent. Thus, when I would ask men about their wives' money, they would claim not to know the total sum involved. But many would add, when the family divides, I'll find out. The wife is encouraged to part with her private wealth by the domestic climate preceding partition, which is characterized by the unity of husband and wife as they fight for their interests and those of their children. End quote.
No, as I said, he means that the wife would hide this private money from her own husband.
Yep. So long as they were part of the clan, she would keep that secret.
But wait a minute. Who would give this wedding gift? It would be the father of the son.
That would be her parents. The wife's parents give the bride. What is it called?
Yeah. So her family give wedding gifts, right?
Yes, yeah. Which is why this is why people
hide it, right?
Yeah. So this is why people also didn't want to have daughters, because you got to pay to marry your daughter. out. Whereas if you have a son, they pay you, you know.
Yeah.
So very expensive to have a daughter. And not only that, with the son, you have to pay the expense of the wedding, sure. But then you get her bridal gift, which comes into your family. And, your son and her still stay with you, so you grow old and they still take care of you. With a daughter, you got to pay to get her out of the house, and you're left with nothing.
Yeah.
Each of the wives of the brothers is likely to be equally narrow horizoned, and moreover, these wives are only very distantly connected to each other through 2 links of affinity, so that potential conflict between the brothers often might take the form of real conflict between the wives. The presence of children as a cause of friction needs hardly to be spelt out. Hen-pecked husbands are by no means unknown in Chinese society, and the extra strain on the family imposed by such a flouting of the priorities is almost certain to bring about conflict.
What does hen-pecked means?
I suppose it's like, where the woman is the nagging wife who controls the husband.
Okay. Okay, let me just see. A hand-packed man is controlled by and a little frightened of a woman, especially his wife. Okay, I understand now. Continue, please.
Yep. Of course, as the next generations come to maturity, the problems become even more acute, for added to the divisive factors already detailed is the lessening degree of relationship between the constituent members of the family. 3, 5, and 7 are full brothers, but 9, 12, and 14 are only first cousins. Let me see where this diagram is at. Here's a diagram for those of you watching. Going back. The Chinese recognized a large body of kin and tended to stress closeness of relationship by, for example, calling these cousins elder brother or younger brother, but they were still concerned with degree of relationship, and the kinship terminology allowed for the precise distinction between brother and cousin to be made when necessary. The extended family then was wide open to fission and was in fact a very difficult group to hold together. In a sociological novel, one family head, quote, had wished to maintain the family in an integral unity. The end he desired was considered by all the local world an eminently laudable and virtuous goal. But the internal conflict between the brothers, between the cousins, and between the wives of the younger generations had made family life difficult on the scale he envisioned. Strife and complaint were too much for him, and he could not help but let the family divide. End quote. Disguised as economic reasons, often the main cause of conflict was the human factor. People just could not get on together. Furthermore, personalities tended to befog the clear structure of family authority, attacking the basis of unity of the family group. At this point, it must be noted that for the sake of clarity, we have been taking only very simple instances of family development. There were all kinds of complicating factors which could change the picture. Domestic architecture, for example, varied from area to area of China, and this could have a considerable bearing on forms of residential organization. In parts of Guangdong province, houses consisted of one single room with a kitchen wash house as an extension out at the front. Kum, by the way, just means with. I don't know why people do that. Like fucking academics. There's obvious simple words that already exist in the language. They have to be fancy and then use old antiquated words.
Yeah. Preciosisms, we call them in Portuguese.
Built in terraces, row upon row, they precluded expansion of single households into complex residential units. Yet in other areas, architecture and space allowed expansion into compounds, extensions to a basic unit being built onto form a U shape so that residential arrangements could reflect an enlarging family group. Again, there is a complication with Chinese terminology. The word jia, which is normally translated as family, often seems to refer to the kind of group which is discussed below in Chapter 3 as a lineage. Further, there were ways in which individuals or conjugal families within the extended family could control certain property and funds quite separate from the joint estate. Given the conflicting pulls of idealized family type and practical considerations of everyday living, and given subcultural diversity throughout China, deviations from the common pattern must be expected.
Just a thing. There is no, like, of course, we are all reading an analysis of actual Chinese family over and against this idealistic conception of family, but there is no argument in favor of this attempt to realize this idealistic generation family, right? Because it seems that even if in some aspects it is worth it, like primarily because if you have a group unity behind you, you are less likely to suffer pressures from the outer world. At the same time, there are so many problems involved in the realization of it that maybe it's not worth at all. Why would you be willing to realize it? You know what I mean?
Yep.
Why 5 generations, not 4 or 6? Okay, 6 generation, maybe it's because like a biological reason, right? People cannot live that long, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's 5 generations because that was just considered ideally doable in the length of the original parents to the furthest down to like great grandsons probably.
Yeah.
But something will come up later in the later chapters about how this tension found objective ways through legal institutions and formal institutions to sidestep this internal conflict issue. And that's what the clan, that's how the clan is born. Like the clan, you might think, oh, the clan is just like this 5-generation family and, or the bigger family. No. The clan ends up being a mediated social institution which is tied to family, but is not directly tied in the way that this is tied. So there literally is in legal sense, there is an incorporation that happens with a clan, in which what happens is, like a corporation, it becomes like what is it? Yeah, a corporation, like an LLC, a legal entity, which then is managed and provides dividends for the entire lineage of the family.
Okay, I see. So there is a part of the family money that would go to this clan bank.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And okay, I see.
And usually what that ends up doing is it pays for the family shrine. And and if it's wealthy enough, it's basically like a generalized family business in which everybody kind of it's like a stock company, but for families.
Yeah.
So continuing, male versus female. There is one aspect of family organization which the reader will no doubt have begun to understand for himself. The Chinese kinship system heavily stressed the importance of the male and of relationships traced through the male. Women were theoretically of little import. They were necessary for the reproduction of the species, and in most cases for their labor in the home, but in both ways they were considered to be there to serve the male in the male principle. In classical thought, they were considered to be minors throughout their lives, subject first of all to the men of the family into which they were born, then on marriage to the men of their husband's family, and finally on widowhood to their sons. These were known as the 3 obeyings of women, and seem to have been expressed first in the Yi Li, a Confucian classic some 2,000 years old. Even in death, the fate of the woman's soul was dependent upon its worship by her descendants through males. Well, I do remember that one. Yeah, only the son's worship counts, not the daughter's.
Yeah, this is a very common feature of family religions. Only the sons can actually feed the dad. Usually
Okay.
accompanied by a certain idea of the man as the only creative principle, right?
Yeah.
So as the man is the only creative principle, he's the only able to draw my whole match to his antecedent.
Did you move away from your mic? Because like, you sound really low.
I'm
Oh,
sorry,
there
I
you go.
am at the kitchen right
Okay, there
now
you go.
because I'm doing a cigarette.
Okay, there you go. I can hear you. So yeah, something that comes clear is there is some explanation of the ancestor worship logic here that also generates out of this idea of the family. I think he'll go over it here, so I'll talk about it later. In fact, of course, women could be much more significant than the above would seem to indicate. China has had an empress. Indeed, in the formidable Empress Dowager towered over the decline of the last imperial dynasty. Again, quote, at one point in the family cycle, a widow might find herself the most senior member alive and in reality, as well as for the purposes of government registration, assume control of the family's estate and affairs in general. Indeed, widowhood was paradoxically a great opportunity afforded to some women in Chinese society. Unless they chose to live in sisterhoods, widowhood was their only chance of exercising supreme authority over adults. In the nature of things, the period of this uncharacteristic mastery was not likely to last long, but while it endured, the perpetual jural minor of her society could in fact enjoy the fruits of domestic power. End quote.
But the text deals with these sisterhoods later on?
Maybe. I've only read like about half the book.
Okay.
I assume sisterhoods means like convents,
Okay.
like Buddhist temples.
Okay. Yeah. That's one option for widows and orphans. Your orphans.
Yep. Accidents of fate and personalities could upset theories, but we must accept that it was normally only the strong personality of a woman which could raise her above her allotted status. Surname was passed on down the male line. Just as in Western society, children took the surname of their father, not of their mother. There was a possibility of a son taking his mother's surname, but this deviant form, resorted to usually only in extreme circumstances, worked in fact to bolster the mother's family group, not the mother herself. The basic family was a group of males which, in order to reproduce itself, imported brides from elsewhere, and since it was primarily a male group, it did not hesitate, of course, to export its own females, its daughters, elsewhere as brides. The family needed women in order to beget children, but its own women, with whom it was prevented from marrying, had to be got rid of in marriage, as they were, in the last analysis, not part of the group. The normal pattern was for a married couple to live in the village of, if not the home of, the husband's parents. Inheritance followed the male line. While sons inherited equal shares of their father's estate, daughters could normally inherit no land or property or immovable goods at all. They might be said to have inherited some movable property in that they took with them some goods when they were married, but they did not share significantly in their parents' estate. There was a huge imbalance in the number of people actively recognized as kin in the maternal and paternal sides of the family. There existed a large spread of kinship terms for the father's side, and the individuals recognized as close kin all the members of the group descended through males from his great-great-grandfather out to his third cousin, and for each of these many relationships there was a distinctive kinship term. On the mother's side, however, the individual was concerned with only a very few people as kin. The number of specific kinship terms was smaller, and there was little importance attached to kin more distant than the mother's brothers. The following examples of the imbalance will perhaps help to explain this better. First, a man could not marry First, a man could not marry anyone of the same surname as himself. since it was assumed that all holders of a given surname must somehow be related to each other. This assumption was manifestly absurd. It is known, for instance, that the common surname Li was conferred upon families as an honor by a Tang dynasty emperor, so that the present-day Li surnames spring from many different stocks. Again, there are two surnames both pronounced Wang in the Cantonese dialect, and the Cantonese Wangs of the two surnames would not intermarry. However, the same two surnames in the Peking dialect are pronounced differently. One is Wang and the other is Huang, so that in the north of China, the two surnames did intermarry. Even where marriage to someone of the same surname was not so seriously disapproved of, it was still the case that marriage to a girl related within that large group descended from the great-great-grandfather was considered highly improper. On the other hand, and this is where the imbalance shows, it was perfectly possible for a man to marry his first cousin on the mother's side. Marriage to the daughter of one's father's sisters, of course, also of course a first cousin, was possible because the bride would have a different surname, but it seems to have been rare.
It is such a gender imbalance that even kinship is considered stronger between men than between man and woman, right?
Yep.
So you basically could almost marry your sister because she was not actually kin of you, because kinship is based in patrilinear considerations.
So long as she had a different name, apparently. Second, there were quite distinct kin terms for one's father's elder brother and his younger brother. Then their wives were similarly distinguished. But on the mother's side, where age was not important, there was no distinction between elder and younger brother. Both were merely called maternal uncle. Third, so heavily was relationship through males emphasized that heredity was supposedly affected by it too. Thus, in the famous 18th century novel, The Honglumeng, The Dream of the Red Chamber, there is a delightful passage where the old grandmother has her daughter's beautiful daughter described to her in the following terms. Quote, "Her whole bearing, madam, is such that she seems to be not a granddaughter on your daughter's side, but rather your granddaughter by your son." Unquote.
Yeah.
By the way, in the lectures on the philosophy of art, I think Hegel actually does mention this book.
This book over here?
Yeah, The Dream of the Red Chamber.
Oh, okay. Hold on. Okay.
He mentions some of the classics of Chinese literature, and of course, we all know how Hegel felt about China.
Yep. How Hegel felt about anything but Europe.
He didn't have very, very many nice things to say. The family was a residential and economic unit composed of males. In order to reproduce itself, it was forced to import women as brides, and it disposed of females born to it by marrying them off to other families. It laid heavy stress on relationships through males and tended to play down those through females, while there was a concomitant stress on the importance of men as opposed to women. Relationships were differentiated according to generation and age, and the attempt was made to reduce the importance and disruptive effect of the necessary important women by subordinating the sex relationship. The basic family of man, wife, and unmarried children could be built on until it was several generations deep, with 5 generations probably being the maximum. Expansion depended mainly on the wealth of the family, poverty tending to preclude expansion beyond the simple or stem family level. It broke up at the point where the estate was divided between the male descendants of the founder and where it ceased to be a single economic unit. The point at which it broke up was determined largely by personality factors. The role of the imported women in precipitating conflict and fission was important, but again, wealth was a significant factor. Among the poor, where a wife was expected to work hard for the family, it was likely that she would be in a stronger position as an individual than among the rich, where she contributed no labor to the family and where she was easily replaceable by concubines, or more rarely through divorce. Among the poor, there was then more likelihood that women would contribute heavily to the pressures of profession, and hence poor families were much more likely to be organized on simple or stem family basis. The economic factor was important in allowing expansion of the family and in holding it together, but could also be an important cause of fission. There must always have been the problem for the individual whether he would gain more by staying in the family or by seceding from it. The wealthier the family, the greater the chances of its remaining intact, not only because it could control its women better, and because its members were better educated and more deeply imbued with Confucian morals, but also because, quote, among the rich and the influential, it is reasonable to assume possible alienation from a source of power would weigh with a man in his decision to press for a division of the household, end quote. All Chinese families could theoretically achieve the ideal, but for the vast majority it could be less than a dream. For some it was partially realizable. For a very few it was achieved. We might say that while not all wealthy families were ideal families, almost all ideal families were wealthy. Eventually, even the ideal family must break up through sheer unwieldiness, through the collapse of its financial resources, through outgrowing its accommodation, or through the distance of the kinship ties which succeeding generations made greater.
What I find interesting here is that the ideal family is seemingly something which was not disputed, right? But it was not a right. You didn't have the right to have an ideal family. Otherwise, there should be institutions that would allow the conditions of realization of this ideal family. And maybe that's one very important point about family rights, right? So if family is a normative institution of freedom, there should be conditions or limitations on the civil society and on political power as to allow for people to actually realize that ideal if they wanted.
Yeah. So yeah.
So
I mean, it's just like now, like right, like where you even in modern societies, like we don't have a right to a family. God knows. But if you have a family, like then there are family rights within that family. Like for example, I think here, or they'll go into detail like later chapters. But I remember in Hegel's philosophy of history, with the section on China, he particularly talks about how like these rights function, where like the wife had the wife and husband had the right to the love of their partner, and if they felt they weren't being loved, they could actually sue them in court for being unpious, for failing filial piety
anymore. My God, imagine to take those kinds of completely spontaneous affections to court, right?
Yeah.
This is unthinkable nowadays, and I think for a reason, right? Like, I'm going to sue you because you don't love me anymore, bitch.
Yeah, so like they codified things that which like really don't make sense as being enforceable by law.
Because
nonetheless,
it's not about
it was there.
You have no responsibility many times in your loss of affection, right?
Yep. So anyways, good reading. This was the end of chapter 1. We'll see where we continue with chapter 2 next time.
Thank you.
Right. See you around.